Continuing our intertestamental period, one of the things that I've been talking about over the last several weeks, and I kept saying that I hadn't remembered the name. We were talking about the various celebrations. We recognize that in the time of the Maccabees in 165 BC, that's when Hanukkah was established and instituted. Several things have been bouncing around my mind this week that I want to share before we get going with the Maccabees. The first is that day that I was speaking of, where several tragedies happened, that is commemorated in Jewish circles, is Tish B'Av is the name of it. It's the 9th of Av, which of course falls on a different day every year in our calendar. But it's the 9th day of that 9th month, the month Av. And this is a really interesting day. The Jews recognize that it's a day of lamentation, a day of mourning, a day of fasting, primarily because of what the Jews call the 5 calamities. And these are 5 terrible events in their history that they put all as having taken place on the 9th of Av. The first one being, they go back to the Pentateuch, and they talk about the 12 spies coming back out of the land of Canaan after having seen the land, and the 10 saying, nope, we need to go back to Egypt, we cannot take this land. And Jewish tradition states that was on the 9th of Av. And then the first temple was supposed to have been destroyed by Babylon between the 8th and the 10th of Av, and specifically the temple having been razed to the ground on the 9th of Av. The second temple is also said to have been destroyed on the 9th of Av. That would be destroyed by the Romans on the 9th of Av as well. And then there was a subsequent destruction of the final stand. One of the final stands in Jewish history against the Romans was in 135 AD, and some 500,000 apparently Jewish civilians were purged at that time within the regions of Rome, and that was supposedly initiated on the 9th of Av as well. There are many other dates that are placed in Jewish history on the 9th of Av. The First Crusade was said to have officially commenced on the 24th of Av, and that it was that entire month kind of leading up to that. And so Av was a big month for that First Crusade. Of course, we know that many Jews were killed in the Crusades. The 9th of Av in 2090 is said to be the day the Jews were expelled from England. The 10th of Av in 1306 was when the Jews were expelled from France. The 7th of Av in 1492 was the day that the Jews were said to be expelled from Spain. You can see a trend there. The Jews also placed the day that Germany entered World War I to be on the 9th of Av. They placed the day that Himmler formally received permission to go about the final solution against the Jews to be on the 9th of Av. They place the mass deportation of the Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto on the 9th of Av. And so there's the 9th of Av has become kind of this date of infamy in Jewish history. Of course, whether the degree to which that is actually historically accurate in every respect, or to which case, sort of like the man Haman in the Bible, the 9th of Av has kind of become the prototypical day of calamity, and so that kind of becomes the focal point, as it were. Some of those are verifiable, other ones perhaps are not. One way or another, the 9th of Av is the day where they recognize all of those calamities, and that's the day that I was thinking of. The other thing that came to my mind, my wife and I were watching a documentary this last week on Moses and the Pentateuch, and whether or not Moses wrote the Pentateuch, and trying to debunk what's called the documentary hypothesis, or the JEDP theory, which espouses that the Pentateuch was actually written during this time, the Maccabean time, and that it was written by a conglomeration of various people And that, of course, that leads to it not being inspired and not being true and it all being tradition, all those things. But one of the things that they had mentioned there was going back to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this is not an unknown fact, but the Dead Sea Scrolls are dated back to somewhere around 200 BC. And those are the oldest functional manuscripts that we have in existence, and they were kind of hidden in these caves, and they were put into these pots, and then those pots were sealed kind of airtight, and they were intended it was very clear that they were intended to be preserved. And if you think about that, you think about what's going on between 150 and 200 BC. You think about the fact that in 168 BC, the Syrians, Antiochus comes in and he does the abomination of desolation, and they're burning manuscripts. And if they find you with any portion of the Bible in your home, you might be killed. It kind of makes you wonder if the reason why these Dead Sea Scrolls were put there, hidden in caves, in a preserved fashion, was so that if push came to shove, and every other documentary evidence of the Word of God was removed from the planet, the generations following would know that there are these scrolls that are hidden in these caves that are preserved, where they could then pull them out and they could continue to speak toward the Word of God. Now, the amazing thing about it is the next nearest, really solid manuscripts we have are moving toward 1000 AD, and then we've got the Aleppo Codex, and if you compare them, they're nearly identical, right? It's just amazing how identical they are. But it really is interesting when you think of all the history around that 150 to 200 BC time frame, and you think of the fact that those Dead Sea Scrolls were there. It gives you a good, perhaps, insight into why those things were buried in a preserved fashion, because any manuscript that could be found was being destroyed in this time, right? And so allowing history to inform history, and then trying to root this again in the history of the time. Okay, so here we are with the Maccabees. The Maccabees, the primary man that got this whole thing rolling, his name was Mattathias. He had 5 sons: John, Simon, Judah, or Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan. He was a Levitical priest of the order of Jehoiarib, so that was the first of the 24 courses. In Sunday school, we're going to talk about those in a couple of weeks, so if you don't know exactly what we're talking about there, we'll dig deeper into it in Sunday school in a couple of weeks. But David, in his day, broke up the priesthood into 24 courses. And throughout the course of a year, each course would have a certain amount of time where they were responsible to minister in the temple, and then they would rotate through. So there were 24 courses. First Chronicles 24 speaks of the prescription of those by David. And Mattathias was a part of the Levitical order, and he was within that first course. And so he was a man that was qualified for the priesthood. His family was qualified for the priesthood. They were Levites, they were priests, and they were a part of those courses that ministered in the temple. So he was at the tip of the spear as it related to the revolt against Syria and the backlash against this secularization of Israel and the Hellenizing of the Jewish people. Those that joined him became known as we haven't had anyone read in Greek in a while, but the Ha-Asidaioi, or the Assyrians, the Chassidim, which would eventually be the Hasidic Jews. And we still have the Hasidic order today. And the Hasidic order came from these Chassidim, or the Assyrians, coming from this word meaning the pious ones. And so they were the pious. They were those who did not want to yield the distinctions of Jewish culture and such. First Maccabees chapter 2, verses 15 through 26 says, though all the nations that are under the king's dominion obey him and fall away every one from the religion of their fathers and give consent to his commandments, yet will I and my sons and my brothers walk in the covenant of our fathers. God forbid that we should forsake the law and the ordinances. That's obviously not all 11 verses, but that idea is the idea that was espoused there. This was the mindset of the Maccabees, and this was the mindset of those that would follow him. God forbid that we should forsake God's law, and God forbid that we should forsake the ordinances. And you notice that word fall away there. There are some interesting connections between this idea of those who fell away and connecting to a New Testament context when Paul says that there must be first a falling away before the Antichrist would come. That word is the same word used in the Apocrypha of those Jews that fell away. And I find it I find the theory very interesting, and I find it somewhat compelling that when Paul speaks of the falling away that will take place, that it's not a falling away necessarily of the church, and the falling away of the world doesn't make a whole lot of sense because the world is fallen away, but that the falling away is again very similar to what we see in Antiochus's day, that there's going to be a group of Jews that go hook, line, and sinker toward Antichrist, and that those first 3.5 years of peace are also going to constitute a dramatic falling away point that will lead to the crisis of the abomination of desolation, just as it did in the days of Antiochus. That's, of course, just a theory, but I do find that theory fairly compelling, and it makes a lot of sense, especially when we compare it to history and the type-antitype relationship. Thoughts? Oh, I'm on the wrong page here. There we go. That'll do it. Okay, so Mattathias and his sons, they became outlaws. And they became outlaws when he killed a group of Jews that were sacrificing to idols. So they would have been sacrificing perhaps to Zeus, clearly Hellenistic, right? Because nothing else was allowed at that time. And they killed them for it. And then the soldiers as well who were compelling these Jews to do it. So it's not as if these Jews were necessarily willingly doing this, but the soldiers were compelling the Jews to this idolatry, and the Jews gave in. And Mattathias and the group that was with him killed both the Jews and the soldiers. And at that point, they became outlaws. They are now fugitives from justice, and they are being hunted down actively. So they flee into a hiding, and they go out into the wilderness, basically. And they do so with the Zealots. This is a group that would have been forming in this time around the Maccabees, a group that is not just well known at this time, but a group that will span into the New Testament, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. We do see the Zealots in the New Testament, and they come into play heavily, not just in this time, but in 70 AD, when Rome finally ends up destroying the temple. That would be in large part because of the Zealots. So about 1,000 who followed the Maccabees with their families were killed when the armies came against them on the Sabbath day, and they refused to fight because it was the Lord's day. It was the Sabbath day. They were slaughtered. And this was another major tipping point for this resistance. To this point, you're talking kind of guerrilla warfare, but more like the movement hadn't fully coalesced yet. There was guerrilla warfare type things going on, but because of such things, such as the fact that they would not fight one day of the week, you're not going to win a war if everybody knows that you're not going to fight on the Sabbath day, right? Because they just amass their armies, and you go in against them on the Sabbath day, and everyone dies, and you win because they won't fight you. And so at this point, Mattathias encouraged them to fight even on the Sabbath. More, of course, joined the cause because of this, and this is really where Mattathias begins to form an army. This is where this is a civil war now between the Syrians and the Jews that are willing to follow them, and Mattathias and those that follow him. And there are competing claims here. Mattathias and the men are now geared up to fight a war. This is one of the many instances that we see throughout history where a very small, relatively minimally armed group of people, because they're significantly more mobile, because they're more nimble, because they fight guerrilla warfare tactics, are able to overcome a much stronger military force. Syria was a significantly stronger military force, but when, and the United States has even seen this with terrorism and insurgents and whatnot, when the people you're fighting are just among the people, right? They're living, they're in houses, they're in hospitals. You don't know where they are. You don't know where they're going to come from. It's nearly impossible to root them out entirely without just genocide, right? Because they could be anywhere. They could be anyone. And this is what the Maccabees used to their advantage. So Mattathias dies 1 year after the revolt really takes form, and his son Judas, that would be his third born, becomes the leader of the revolt. And Judas Maccabees is really the one that takes center stage from a military perspective. He was the great military leader. Many would call him a military genius. So Mattathias, he was a good leader. He was the ideological head. But Judas, when he took over, things really started happening. So he's the one that began leading really stunning victories against Syria. Unheard of victories you would never expect. And he's the one that brings about, 3 years after the fact, in 165 BC, the retaking of Jerusalem. So in 165, Lysias of Syria comes with a very large army. Judas utterly defeats him, and he takes possession of Jerusalem. And then, as we've talked about already, on the 25th day in December, the 25th of Kislev, obviously December comes and goes on that day, right? Hanukkah. You'll find Hanukkah sometimes early in the month of December, sometimes much later in the month, and that's because Hebrew calendar is a lunar calendar, and the Gregorian calendar is a solar calendar, and so there's a lot of play between those two. The temple was cleansed on the 25th of Kislev and brought back into operation, and the Jews commemorated this victory with an 8-day festival of lights, as we talked about already, remembered as the Feast of Hanukkah or the Feast of Lights. We talked about that in the New Testament, I believe, last week. So let's talk about these zealots. Coming back to a major player, we're going to focus in for a few moments on who these zealots were. The zealots were a Jewish party beginning around the time of the Maccabean Revolution, and they were most likely an offshoot of the pious. So you had the pious, right, the Chassidim, and then from there you would have this offshoot of them that they called themselves the Zealots, very observant of the law, not so much a religious sect like the Pharisees, and then we'll talk about the Essenes, but they were a political sect. So they were a significantly more political than religious, but they were very religious. Their drive was political in nature, but they were religiously observant. We might call them the religious right. Right? So you have this whole contingency of people for the last 50 years in the United States who are religious people, but they're not actually driven on religious grounds. They're driven by political ideology. And that was the Zealots. The Zealots were not so much looking for holiness or distinction among Israel as it related to the law. They were observant of the law. They respected the law, but what they were looking for is their Messiah, their political Messiah. To this end, they were very willing to use violence, assassinations. It didn't matter. They were very pragmatic, and they were pragmatic because politics, the political end, was their primary consideration. Luke chapter 6, Acts chapter 1. There's Simon Zelotes, right? Simon the Zealot in the New Testament. He was a zealot. That's what he was. That's what he was defined by. He was a part of this political order, which was still happening in the day of Rome, and of course would grow in the time of Rome until the final climax in 70 AD, and that would be their big contribution. 66 to 73 AD, they were instrumental in the failed rebellion against Rome. Yes, Chuck.
You went over reserved violence, assassination, and hatred for
Yes.
You get out of that? I didn't hear that. Sorry.
Well, I didn't mention explicitly foreigners, but yeah, they resorted to violence and assassination was their thing. And they were very much so nationalistic. They were a nationalistic group of political zealots who were willing, they would be the, well, no, because even the Trumpian wing is not the idea of we're going to kill or assassinate to get foreigners out of our land. They would be more like the Charlottesville white nationalist. Antifa, but Antifa is not white nationalist. They're like the opposite of that. But Antifa except white national, the neo-Nazi, basically.
Well, they're trying to protect their homeland, so.
Correct. And trying to drive out foreigners.
Yeah, I mean, Israel is a huge place that's surrounded by massive enemies.
Yeah.
Back then it was.
Yeah, but so the difference between the zealot and then the pious, the Hasidim, is that the pious would have, initially they would not fight on the Sabbath. The pious would have been significantly more restrained. God will give me justice types. Naturally, out of this came the need to fight to preserve their way. But they would have been significantly more restrained, whereas the zealots would have been no holds barred. Whatever it takes, they need to go away. And so that's the difference between the religious drive and the political drive. And this actually it is very evident today, even in the Never Trump and the Trumpian sort of contingencies. Now, the Never Trump contingency tends to be a fairly... There's two different parts of the Republican Party. One of them is what we might call the evangelical purist. And then the other end of that is just kind of the rhino, right? And the evangelical purist would have been that kind of that Hasidim type. And then you have those that would say, no, and we're going to do what we're going to do to win. And if it takes a bull in a china shop to do it, then that's what we're going to do. And that would have been the zealot, right? So they've broken off from that just the pure religious ideology, and they've pragmatized a little bit in order to bring about political ends that they felt were necessary, and in all the right ways in their mind, right? So they're saying, well, if we don't have the politics, then we lose the religion, because if Syria wins, we lose Judaism, right? So we're going to do what's necessary, and we're going to compromise ourselves, as it were, politically. And really, so that's very similar to what has happened in a sense with the Republican Party and President Trump, right? That there has been a compromise of principle in order to preserve deeper principle, in a sense, is what has happened. And that's kind of where the zealots were. Only, they were willing to kill, and that's not Trump's space. That's Antifa, that's the neo-Nazis, that's not President Trump's, right? Yeah. Yep. Other thoughts on that? Sarah?
So with the foreigners, so they were just saying get any foreigners out of the land, not just the ones that are oppressing us. Because there's always been foreigners who have lived in the land
Correct.
of Israel, with Israel peaceably. They have, peaceably done that.
Yep.
But the results were saying nobody.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. They were entirely nationalistic, no foreigners, no one but Israel. And this would grow into, in the days of the Hasmonean dynasty, this would grow into direct persecution of the Edomites, of the Samaritans, of all of the surrounding people groups. And that would be a large part of what leaves such a bad taste in the mouths of the Samaritans. And that's what we see bubble up in John chapter 4 with the Samaritan woman at the well. And that is why when Jesus gives the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? And so a Levite walks by and a priest walks by and they don't help this Jew. And then a Samaritan walks by. Jesus could have used any other nationality in the world and had less of an impact in that parable than using a Samaritan, because the Samaritans were like the scum between the toes of the world to the Jewish people. and it's going to come back to that zealot nationalistic zeal, whereby the Samaritans were deeply persecuted by a nationalistic Jewish people who were at that time deeply racist. Beyond just nationalists, they were deeply racist at that time. Sarah?
Well, and the Samaritans at this point are considered very impure. They're considered very mixed blood, correct?
Yes, but not as much as you might expect. So, of course, in the days of Nehemiah was really big on that, right? With Sanballat and Tobiah, really big on the fact that they had no part in Israel because they were mixed blood. That idea would soften throughout time, and a big reason why is because the Samaritans were oftentimes very, very eager to associate themselves with Israel at various times throughout this intertestamental period. And so they would be very kind, they would seek to get along, they would get along, and there were not a lot of, many Samaritans even would come to Jerusalem for some of these feasts and such and take part. Now that's going to change. And we already talked about it a little bit during the days of Alexander the Great. Remember, there was a temple that was built in Gerizim, and so that there was a dividing there in part. And then there's going to come a point where the Jews are going to raise that temple to the ground. They're going to kill a bunch of Samaritans, and any sort of kindness between them is done at that time. But that deep half-breed rejection, bigotry has not fully formed yet at this point. There are those differences and those distinctions, but not heavily. To gain the fullest flavor of the zealots, I'm trying to think of the name of it now. Name escapes me. What's the name of that final fortress, the last stand? Masada. Thank you. In 73 A.D., the last stand of the Jewish people as it related to the fall of Israel as a country was at Masada. And it was one of those fortresses, you know, when David's writing in the Psalms and he says, "The Lord is my fortress," or "I will run to a rock that is higher than I." He was referencing down in the south part of Israel, in that area of Edom, near where Petra is, and some of those areas where they would build into the rocks. There were these gigantic rocks, and they would build into those rocks fortresses. And it would be very, very difficult for anybody to, we actually see them in the Kings and Chronicles as well. Some of the kings in times of great need would run down to those fortresses and would barricade themselves there so that they could continue to rule Israel from there. And the Zealots were the ones who really kicked off the final overthrow of Rome. In 70 AD, the temple was destroyed, and the final stand was at Masada. And there, a group of zealots with their wives and their children made a final stand for several months, and as happened with Alexander the Great and many others, Rome literally built a ramp, a mountain, against Masada to get up to the top of it to besiege them. And when they went in there, they found everyone dead. They had all basically done kind of one of the ritualistic suicide type things, and everyone was dead there, with the idea being that you will never take me alive, right? That, and we've talked about kind of how ingrained this is. When you think about the spirit of Israel in the days of the New Testament, the tremendous degree to which they were looking for their Messiah, that spirit of the zealots, that kind of nationalistic zeal, that's what's building in this time. And it really, I mean, it climaxed there with Masada. But what's fascinating is that various contingencies of the Israeli Defense Force swear themselves in at Masada. They go to Masada for the swearing-in ceremony for the IDF. They've not forgotten, right? That same idea, that idea that we are fighting for sovereignty, the very thing that the Zealots gave their lives for, that political zeal for sovereignty, that this is their land, no one's going to take it from them, they will fight to the death for their land. That's where they go to swear in the various contingencies of the IDF today. They go down to Masada. And so to understand the mindset, it's still there in Israel today. And that'll help you understand just how important the land is to Israel. Just how important that homeland, that sovereignty is to them. And read that into all of the expectations of what Israel was looking for when Jesus came as Messiah. That kind of nationalistic zeal. Chuck, did you have a...
But there's still modern day zealots there. I mean, I would imagine that's carried over.
Not officially, like there's not an official zealot party, but in many ways they all are. That's kind of, since 1948, you can't really afford to not be a zealot politically and be over in Israel, right?
Every single citizen has to become a zealot. I mean,
Right.
Citizen soldier, so.
Yeah, with the distinction being that Israel today is not nationalistic to the point where they would kick out foreigners, right? They've got a tremendous number of Arabs within their borders as citizens. They've got them in their government, right? They've got a lot of Muslims in their government. They're just not the majority party. And so you don't see that degree of zealotry, but they will fight to the death, of course, for their right to exist. And that mindset formulated in a brand new way in this period of the Maccabees. The Maccabees are the forerunners to that kind of zeal, that kind of need to just, to have their land, to exist, to be sovereign, that itch and that craving to be sovereign. All of that's happening in this time, and it really has never gone away since. So Judas, after taking Jerusalem, turns his sights towards strengthening and extending Jewish power. At this point, Judas has in his mind not just getting Syria out of there, but he's thinking Jewish state. He's thinking national state here. He attacks the Idumeans, and that would be the posterity of Esau. He attacks the Ammonites, and he incites the whole region against them. He's trying to push them out to take back Israel's borders. So he's expanding Israel's borders by expanding into Idumea, expanding into the Ammonites. Of course, all of these people are under Syrian control, right? But he's expanding in those ways. And you notice there at the bottom, at this point, the struggles of the Maccabees has changed from religious preservation, and that would be like what the Hasidic Jews wanted. They wanted to preserve the distinctions of their religion. Now the temple is cleansed, they're going again, things are good, they've got power, and now the zealots are taking over, right? Now we're talking about political purity. Now we're talking about nationalistic zeal. Now we're talking about Jewish independence and the spreading of the Jewish state to erect solid, strong borders and to have sovereignty. And again, that spirit is one that never really has left the Jewish mind. So Antiochus, as we mentioned before, dies in 164 BC. Lysias, who was the general under Antiochus, he attacks Israel again, 120,000 footmen, 20,000 horsemen, 32 elephants. He gains victory over Judas, over the army as a whole, and he begins to siege Jerusalem. This siege took place on a sabbatical year, which made it very difficult because during the sabbatical year, of course, they're not planting, right? They had stored up from the previous years so that they could have enough to live throughout this year. That meant that their city was lacking in food stores because they were having to dip into those stores normally just to eat. Fortunately for Israel at this time, Philip, who was the king of Persia, so that would have been significantly over to the east there. Once again, it's Greek, right? Because that would have been another Greek general whose posterity is over there. But Philip, he's approaching from the south, and he forces Syria to withdraw from the siege because Syria can't fight along two lines, and Philip is the more obvious threat. And so Syria makes a league with Jerusalem, with Israel, that says, you don't cause us any more problems, you don't keep your warmongering ways, and we'll let you worship your God. So now we're kind of back to pre-Antiochus situation, where Syria is effectively in control, but they are now allowed to worship their own God again. So the Jews now have that going for them, and Antiochus at that time leaves. However, he was not true to his word. As soon as things are taken care of with Philip, he goes back to Jerusalem. He demolishes Jerusalem. He kills Menelaus, the high priest at the time. A man named Alcimus is how we'll generally call him. His Jewish name was Jacob. He arrives on the scene. He's friendly to Syria, and Judas Maccabeus, of course, is still around. And Alcimus asks for Syria to help him with this problem of Judas. So Syria names him the high priest after Menelaus is slain. And many, even of the Hasidim, are willing to accept him. He gives credentials. Apparently, it was not true that he was of the line of Aaron, but he gives credentials whereby he claims to be of the line of Aaron. Many of the pious agree with him, and they see him as kind of a middle ground diplomatic guy who can work with Syria while simultaneously allowing them all of their traditions. It was very important for him to get the pious on board with that, or else he'd never have the support of the people. Judas was not on board, however, and when Alcimus does become the high priest, he ends up killing 60 of the leaders of the Hasidim, of the pious, at the one point, and this kicks up another civil war. And Alcimus has Syrian support, and Judas, along those ideological and religious lines, of course, is on the other end of this. And once again, Judas ends up prevailing, and in 161 BC, Syria again falls to Judas. Well, at this point, Judas is done playing games, right? He's not going to do this thing where he makes a league, where he compromises in any way. It's another step toward the zealotry and the national fervor of the Jews. So he's resolved to relinquish every last vestige of Syrian control. He sends two men, Eupolemus and Jason, to enlist the help of Rome in casting off Syrian domination. So Rome agrees to this, and quite readily agrees to this. Rome wanted Syria. They were very interested in taking Syrian land. Syria was still quite well entrenched. Syria had a lot of natural backing among not just the Syrian people, but all of the people that they had conquered. And Rome wants the in. So they get with Judas. They know Judas is a tremendous military leader, and they form a mutual aid pact. Now, Israel will never actually be able to be of any aid to Rome, right? So the Romans see this as very flexible, as oftentimes the more powerful person in an agreement does, because they're getting the benefit, whatever benefits they think are, from leaguing with this much less powerful nation, but this less powerful nation has no foot to stand on as it relates to any sort of enforcement on their end of the deal. So this agreement is flexible. That'll come up very importantly a little bit later. But Rome does inform Syria at this time that the Jews are allies, that they are under Roman protection. This doesn't matter. The new Roman general named Demetrius had already invaded Judea, destroyed the armies of Judas, and Judas had been killed in battle, or would be killed in battle at this time. So Judas dies around that 161 BC time in battle against the Syrians. Now Rome does have an interest to play in this region. However, the region is in a pretty bad place. Now do take note that Josephus conflicts with the book of Maccabees and history about this. Josephus says that Alcimus died before Judas, and that Judas was named the high priest 3 years prior to his death in 161. We don't see that in any of the other histories. Seems as though Alcimus was the high priest until 159 BC, 2 years after Judas dies. He dies, and that Judas never actually became an official high priest in Israel. There's discrepancies. Josephus was not it was not uncommon for him to be wrong on things. So we would probably stick with just historical precedent and the book of Maccabees on that one, and not follow Josephus's account. And this will begin what we would effectively know to be the Hasmonean dynasty of high priests. The name Hasmonean, according to Josephus, was derived from a man named Hasmoneus, who was an ancestor of the Maccabee family. And you notice there, Alcimus perhaps dies around 159 BC, and then we see Jonathan Maccabeus become the high priest in 153 BC. So there's going to be this period of time where there is no high priest in the land, and then Jonathan will take over, and from there you find this, string of high priests going down to 37 BC, each one being a part of the Hasmonean dynasty. And the major players in this are going to be John Hyrcanus, of course, Jonathan Maccabeus, and Antigonus there at the bottom is going to be pretty important as well. So this is the dynasty that we begin to see play out here of high priests. And the high priests, as we'll see in just a minute, this high priest dynasty is set up in such a way as to basically be a placeholder until the Messiah would come. So once again, remember, the zealot perspective, the high priest is there, and every time you see a high priest there, he's ruling as high priest but not as king. The reason why he's not king is because a king had to come from the line of Judah, and the next king that they were expecting to be on the throne would be their Messiah. Let's see. Yep, we can do this. Okay, so in 161, after the death of Judas, Jonathan is elected to be leader of the conflict. Alcimus, he was killed in 159 BC from history, at least as far as we know, by devout Jews because of his impiety, because of his league with Syria. At this point, there was no patience for anything as far as the Syrian friendliness would be concerned. The office of the high priest remained vacant until Jonathan Maccabeus took it in 153. The Sanhedrin, however, was still operating. And we've not talked about the Sanhedrin. We'll do that probably there'll be time. We'll do it this week. There was a revolt in Syria in 153 BC. Jonathan used this time where Syria was still exercising some power. Syria had to worry about themselves, their own borders. So Jonathan uses this to drive out all the Greek supporters, to drive Syria out. And this is officially when Syria was driven out of Jerusalem. 153 BC, Jonathan is then made the high priest and thus the leader of Israel. And the region was effectively under the control of the Maccabees fully. Syria had now been officially driven out. Jonathan would eventually fall to deceit by a regent named Trypho of Syria, and he was murdered. And he would die in 143 BC. Let's talk about the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was a council. It was a council of 70. We see them in Matthew 5:22. Jesus says, "But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without cause shall be in danger of the judgment, and whosoever shall say to his brother Raca shall be in danger of the council. But whosoever shall say thou fool shall be in danger of hellfire." So we see this idea of the council, Jesus acknowledging the council existed. We also see this council in Acts chapter 5 and Acts chapter 23. The apostles would stand before the council of the Sanhedrin. Jesus would stand before the council of the Sanhedrin. Paul would stand before the council of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin were very active. It was a group of 70 men, and then there would be very similar to what we might find in any other political governing body. You would have different ideologies that would sit on the council, and then the majority ideology would be the one that's in power. And there were very few times within the course of the Sanhedrin from the Maccabees onward where the Pharisaic order or that order of the pious was not in control. There would be a few times where the Sadducees and the orders surrounding some other order would have a measure of control, but it was a very rare thing. And this Sanhedrin would effectively be kind of like the Congress, right? So you have the high priest, and he's the guy in charge, and then you'd have the Sanhedrin. It would probably be closer to a British parliamentarian system because the president is not supposed to have the power he has today. But more like a British parliamentarian system where out of the various parties would come a man who leads, and then you'd have various other ideologies. Council of 70, made up of the priestly nobles in Israel who had limited and delegated authority over both religious and civil matters in Judea. There is no record of the Sanhedrin prior to the days of Antiochus and of Ptolemy. Rabbinical tradition, of course, placed it all the way back to the men that Moses appointed at the behest of his father-in-law Jethro in order to help judge the people. And so in trying to give some credibility to their order, they look back to Moses and they say Moses appointed these people to lead underneath him in order to delegate authority and such. And so they root the Sanhedrin there. However, the actual name Sanhedrin was not one that would be common in the days of Antiochus. We really don't see that come up until really not long before Christ. In 56 BC, Gabinius, general of Pompeii, this would be a Roman general, divided all of the Jewish territory into 5 Sanhedras. Allotted over these was a council, this council that had been operating for some time called the Sanhedrin Council. When Caesar took over, he abolished the monarchy, he abolished the high priestly power officially, though there was still a high priest, but he did not abolish the Sanhedrin. And he gave these Sanhedrin the ability to function nonetheless. After Antipater appointed Hebrew over the region of Galilee, we'll talk about that more later, Herod killed a band of robbers without the Sanhedrin's authority. The Sanhedrin actually called Herod before them to answer for killing these Jews without their permission. And this made, and if you recall Herod from the New Testament, he was a very self-centered man, a very temperamental man. He was very embarrassed. He was very angry. So the first thing he did as king of Judah was to kill 45 of the council there, probably the 45 of the 70 that voted against him or that spoke against him. And so the Sanhedrin were whittled down, and after that, of course, new people replaced them, and there would have been a very different dynamic to what the Sanhedrin recognized. This is why in the days of Jesus, the Sanhedrin were very careful to place themselves under the authority of the Roman governors when it came to whether or not Jesus was crucified. That during the days of Herod, any perceived authority that the Sanhedrin thought they had, they realized that they only had to whatever degree Rome was happy with them, right? So it really put them in their place at that time. Until that time, they truly did have effectively complete control over the region. Following Herod's death, his son Archelaus was given authority over Judea and Samaria. And so the Sanhedrin were no longer given authority over all 5 regions. They were restricted primarily to only the place where Archelaus was given authority, which was Judea and Samaria. And then, of course, they had nothing to do with the Samaritans, so they claimed no authority over Samaria, which means the Sanhedrin only had authority over Judea, which is why when Jesus goes to Galilee, he's pretty much untouchable by the Sanhedrin, by the Jewish authorities. He goes to Galilee, he's doing his thing. It's only when he comes down into Judea that then he's able to be arrested, he's able to be tried, all of those things are happening. Now, the Romans could still try him up north, but that's not going to happen, right? But the Sanhedrin only had jurisdiction over the things that happened in Judea, not in Samaria. I mean, technically they may have because of Archelaus, but they didn't touch Samaria, and they didn't have Galilee technically directly under their control, under their authority. So Galilee was a place where Jesus could go and function generally freely. And thus, if you look at, and that's why, especially in Galilee, only the Pharisees are giving him trouble, right? Not the Sadducees, not the Sanhedrin. He's not being called before any councils. But then every time he goes to Jerusalem, right, he's getting into trouble because the Sanhedrin are there, the Sadducees are there. There's a whole different authority structure there in Judea. Thoughts? Okay, we'll finish up this Sanhedrin stuff, and then we'll be done for tonight. So after Archelaus, Roman authority switched to the procurators, and that is when Sanhedrin authority began to gain some again, as there wasn't as much central authority. The procurators had a little bit less direct authority after Archelaus's authority waned, and it was switched to a much smaller group of people, or a less powerful group of rulers in the region. By the time of Christ, the council was made up primarily of these two factions, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Civil jurisdiction over Judea alone. Sanhedrin authority, of course, ceased with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. And the Sanhedrin has not really been back since in any way, shape, or form. So that's the council, and that's the council that Jesus was brought before, and that's the council that Paul was brought before, and that's the council that the apostles were brought before. Goes all the way back to that time of the Maccabees. Yes, sir?
So the Sanhedrin was predominantly Sadducees and Pharisees.
Predominantly, yes.
Which is why Paul kind of threw them at each other a couple times when he was called.
Yeah, so Paul, recall there was the time where Paul mentioned, was it the resurrection or something? And then the council just started fighting with each other. And they kind of forgot about Paul. And then Paul had to be dragged out because they all started fighting. And then he, and he almost got himself killed. That bickering was because he said something and the Pharisees are like, yeah. And the Sadducees are like, no! And then they kind of boom, boom, boom. And then everyone's angry at him and whatnot. So that was exactly what he did there. He played them against each other. Any other thoughts? So, yeah, when you understand these things, you understand a little bit better. I think I will try to remember to bring it next week. I'll try to bring the account where Jesus plays the Pharisees and the Sadducees against each other. But when you understand the dramatic difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, when you understand the unique interplay of the Sanhedrin and their kind of the balance of power, then those various accounts of Paul before the Sanhedrin or of Jesus speaking to the Pharisees and the Sadducees together in the temple before his crucifixion kind of take on new life. Because you know what's going on there. You know that Jesus just said something that the Pharisees liked. And so the Pharisees are kind of happy, and then he'll say something the Sadducees like, and so the Sadducees are kind of happy, and now they're both kind of happy at something Jesus said, but then they both really dislike the other thing that Jesus said, and then they get distracted from Jesus, and they start getting on each other because of all of their ideological bickering and differences, and then they kind of forget that they're supposed to be enemies of, working together against Jesus or against Paul, as the case may be. Okay, we'll stop there and pick up next week, and we'll start with the Essenes. And we'll talk about them, a third Jewish sect that's not seen very much in the New Testament, but which is there, and we'll continue with that history.
Thank you for listening to Pastor Jamen Wikler from Legacy Baptist Church in Buffalo, Minnesota. More information about Legacy Baptist Church and a library of sermons are available at www.legacybaptistchurch.net.